The house had been full since late afternoon, waiters going back and forth with trays slick with sweat and champagne, photographers adjusting light and angle. The musicians were sound-checking near the main staircase, and the staff spoke in short whispers so as not to draw attention. Lucia moved in the rhythm she could follow, with her eyes closed, checking restrooms, collecting forgotten glasses, straightening misaligned chairs. Almost no one saw her, and that for her had always been both tool and protection. She knew which doors stuck, where the floor creaked, which chandelier shocked you if you brushed against it. Alfonso's wedding to Vivian looked like an event staged for a magazine, with too many flowers and rehearsed smiles. Even so, behind the arrangements there was the ordinary noise of a kitchen, of ice in a bucket, of a low radio in the storeroom. And over all of it, a feeling she couldn't name, as if the house were breathing differently. The clock struck 9:17 p.m. when that feeling took shape. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a fall, it was something else, small and insistent. It first came as a sound that didn't belong to the hall, a muffled cry, almost swallowed by brick. Lucia heard it in the service corridor that connects the pantry to the guests' powder room, a stretch where the air usually smells of cleaning product. She stopped the cart beside the dented outlet and waited, holding her breath to her own rhythm. The sound repeated, irregular, like someone without. The strength to persist. The corridor, always cold, seemed to narrow a little, and the creaks of the floor betrayed a detail few would notice. The source wasn't in the ceiling or the duct, but in the side wall, 5 steps past the peeling door jamb. Lucia placed her hand against it, and the plaster gave back a chill that didn't match the humid night. She calculated mentally what lay on the other side, an old brick wall forming the back of an empty storage room. Behind that wall, in theory, only dust and plumbing. But the sound didn't match any plumbing at all. The Baroque frame hanging there had always bothered her because of its weight and the side nail poorly centered. Lucia locked the cart's wheels, braced her foot on the baseboard, and lifted the piece just enough to slacken the hook's tension. Her arm trembled more from fear of drawing attention than from effort, and the frame yielded with a dry crack. Behind it, a strip of wall with a slightly different paint revealed someone had tampered there not long ago. She ran her nails along the corner and felt loose sand, mortar that hadn't cured like the rest. She pressed with her knuckles and one brick danced, less fixed than it should have been. The crying came clearer then, not louder, just less distant. Lucia slid her hand into the jagged gap and touched damp fabric, skin far too hot, a tiny tremor that didn't feel like an adult's fever. She drew back for a second to wedge in her keychain flashlight, but the beam barely entered. The space was narrow, made to conceal, not to hold. The identification didn't come by face. It came by minutiae. Only someone who lived in the house would notice. The sleeve scraping her skin had the torn embroidery of the team jersey Julian never took off, a marker stain at the hem. The smell was dried sweat with old dust, an odor that betrays hours of confinement and poor ventilation. Lucia called the name in her head, as if speaking aloud could collapse the little air there was. Inside, she counted the days mentally, recalled the excuse of a visit to a cousin, the suitcase that never left the closet, the room tidied too quickly. On the other side, a weak response. Not a word, but the attempt to bring an arm closer to her touch. Her fingers brushed smaller fingers, with fine marks that looked like repeated scratches. There was no time for long reasoning, only for decisions that move the body before the mind. She pulled her hand back, grabbed the smaller bottle from the cart, and tried to fit the spout into the opening. Half spilled on the floor, the other half disappeared inside with the sound of hurried swallowing. Lucia reset the frame carefully when the click of heels crossed the main corridor from the direction of the hall. She kept her gaze down and her body aligned with the cart, the manner of someone smoothing a cloth that was already clean. Vivian passed the angle where the curtain created a shadowed recess and, without stopping, swept the space with that measuring look. There was no scene, no long words, only the silent message of someone who perceives minute displacements. The new lady of the house had a habit of noticing small things: a glass in the wrong spot, a flower turned the wrong way for the photo. The message hung in the air like a strong smell. There were limits that shouldn't be crossed on that night of smiles. Lucia knew this kind of message, and she also knew the sound behind the wall, which doesn't accept protocol. In the hall, a microphone crackled in a test, and the band tuned again, a sign the toast would begin in minutes. Time suddenly took on body and weight, like a brimming bucket threatening to tip. She understood it couldn't be later. The kitchen was almost empty. Only the noise of the exhaust and ice clinking on stainless steel when she opened the cabinet for the spare sound system. The microphone was kept in a cardboard box with tired tape, used at Christmas and for last-minute announcements. It worked on the first red light, which was something of a miracle for forgotten equipment. Lucia tucked the device into the pocket of her apron, a position that didn't catch the eye and didn't smack against her thighs as she walked. She remembered the shortest route to the dais, cross along the Winter Garden side, cut behind tables 7 and 8. On the way, she took from the cart a pipe wrench that served as a lever for the frame's unruly nail in case she needed to run back. The plan had many holes, but it had the essential: a countdown and a simple objective. In the hall, Alfonso was already raising his glass and the lighting crew was brightening the central chandelier. Lucia drew a deep breath once, and it wasn't courage. It was acceptance that no one else would do it for her. Then she set the cart in motion and entered where she'd never been permitted to enter before. Crossing the hall required the kind of attention that doesn't draw attention. Lucia moved along the edge of the numbered. Tables, dodging chairs pulled out too far, and bags on the floor. The photography team was setting a tripod near the dais, and an assistant was marking positions with tape on the marble. Guests leaned their bodies inward as they chatted, making crooked corridors between tall arrangements. The main microphone hissed briefly, and, soon after, the toast began. There were phones already raised before any words, a common practice at parties this size. Alfonso's face, enlarged by the lighting, carried tiredness hidden under event makeup. Vivian's presence at his side seemed measured, a choreography of hands and a trained smile. Lucia stopped 2 steps past table 8 and tested with the tip of her thumb the button of the microphone in her pocket. The red light blinked. Her heart matched its rhythm like a stubborn metronome. The hall had its own way of quieting when a voice took the lead, but that only happens when the voice is expected. When the feedback cut the toast, the reaction came in. Waves, surprise, irritation, curiosity. Lucia climbed the small side step of the dais, not like someone seizing the stage, but like someone crossing a crowded crosswalk. The sound team took a while to understand where the signal came from, because the cables didn't match the event map. The first looks were from employees. Only afterward did the guests notice the figure in an apron with a device in hand. There was no crafted speech, just direct information spoken in the cadence of someone gauging the air between one sentence and another. She said there was a child in the service corridor, behind a wall with a Baroque frame, in critical condition. She specified the location, cited the smell, the temperature of the skin, and the sound of muffled crying. She spoke the only possible name, and that narrowed the distance between faces in the hall. The clinking of glasses set down on tables was the first indicator that the message had gotten through. The father's reaction wasn't theatrical. It was practical and disordered, as if stumbling were part of the path. Alfonso came down the front of the dais, knocking over a chair and snagging the tablecloth hem on his shoe. 2 guests reached for his arm by reflex of social restraint, but he had already gained speed. The in-house security glanced at their own radios before moving, waiting for instructions that didn't come in time. Vivian remained motionless for instants that felt many. as if the scene needed confirmation before it could exist. Someone in the back asked if it was a kind of performance, and another replied that it made no sense at a wedding. The nearest tables opened an improvised corridor, and the photo crew followed by inertia, trained never to miss a turn. Lucia went down the same side she had climbed, slipping the microphone back into her pocket from pure need to have her hands free. She kept her focus on the route she had already drawn in her head. Winter garden, service corridor, frame. The guests, now on. Their feet left a wake of hurried steps behind them. In the service corridor, the temperature seemed colder than half an hour earlier, or maybe it was sweat drying on skin. The frame was still in place, the side nail vibrating a millimeter from the traffic of too many people in the hall. Alfonso arrived first and didn't wait for tools. He wedged his hands along the edge and pulled with his whole body. The picture fell with the impact, and the wood struck the marble, tearing a piece from the trim. Behind it, the strip of fresh mortar revealed the patchwork, with poorly sanded burrs and a color off from the rest of the wall. He began loosening bricks with the urgency that ignores pain, opening space with short blows of someone who refuses to think of failure. The smell that came from inside was heavy, a mix of stagnant damp and a body under prolonged stress. A few steps back, the first phones lifted to find an angle, but the corridor's poor light limited the record. Lucia positioned herself on the left, ready with the pipe wrench, offering it simply, without words. The tool slid into the gap and helped dislodge the third brick, the one that held the rest. The opening widened enough for an arm and then half a shoulder, and that was enough to touch skin. The body temperature inside was above normal, suggesting a fever sustained for hours. Chapped lips and shallow breathing indicated advanced dehydration, signs any clinic attendant would recognize. The team jersey, now filthy, with dust and sweat, confirmed the identification beyond doubt. There was no collective outcry. The dominant sound was the intake of breath by more than one person at once. Lucia signaled for water, and a bottle appeared from hand to hand, opened in haste, half already spilled. The liquid went in little by little in short tilts to avoid choking a dry throat. Alfonso held the small body with clumsy care, typical of someone trying to remove quickly without causing further harm. The remaining bricks yielded in sequence after the first successful shift. One of the security guards made space because the narrow corridor was already blocked by too many people, each wanting to see. When Julian came out of the wall, the weight of him in his father's hands told the loss of strength better than any words. The body was too light for his age and rigid at the points where a forced position exacts a swift price. The team called an ambulance by radio, and the clock marked time that always seems longer when waiting for help. Lucia kept focus on simple vital signs: wrist pulse, breathing rhythm, minimal response to the phone's light stimulus. Practical information circulated without formality. Hydrate in sips, keep him warm, don't try to feed him there. The house, beyond the corridor, still played its party music, as if the event didn't know what was happening. The contrast between the bright hall and the narrow corridor amplified the sense of wrongness. Vivian appeared at the edge of the angle, standing, watching without approaching, like someone measuring consequences before stepping. The silence around her wasn't respect, it was suspension, the wait for the movement that would define sides. And for a few seconds that weighed, no one said anything, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The first word left Alfonso's mouth at a volume that didn't match the size of the space. It wasn't a question or an order, it was his son's name, spoken like calling back a part of oneself. Julian answered with a frail sound, a breath mixed with a whimper that was enough to make the father bend down to the floor. The breathing staggered again, which was already progress compared to the near nothing of minutes before. Lucia kept the exact distance, not intruding, but ready to support in case the man's body collapsed. The corridor now smelled of disinfectant and panic, a mixture that clings to clothes. Someone brought a blanket from the guest powder room, and another. Employees switched on all the lights, which made the place feel even more claustrophobic. The sounds from the hall kept coming, distant, reminding that the party hadn't entirely stopped. Vivian took 2 steps into the corridor and then retreated, her heel catching on the uneven floor. People began to record the moment without knowing whether to help or simply film. The sirens were heard almost at the same time the first TV camera appeared at the main entrance. News travels fast when it involves a known surname and an expensive event. The ambulance took less than 20 minutes, but at the pace of those breaths, it felt like an entire night. The paramedics arrived with the methodical calm of those who have seen similar things too often to be startled. One of them, a woman with a locked expression, ordered space and set up an IV in the corridor itself, ignoring carpets and flowers. Lucia held the flashlight while the other applied oxygen, and the father stayed motionless at the side, his hands clenched on the blanket. Vivian watched from afar, posture too erect for someone declaring innocence. Questions from security and onlookers began to mix, creating noise that disrupted the medic's commands. The scene turned into something between rescue and spectacle, each camera click reinforcing the absurd gap between facade and truth. When the boy was placed on the stretcher, the corridor's heavy air finally shifted a little. Lucia leaned against the wall, unaware that she was still, clutching a crumpled cleaning cloth in her hands. Fingers marked with mortar left streaks of grime on the white fabric, a contrast she didn't notice at first. People began to disperse as soon as the sound of the gate gave away the ambulance's departure. Some guests decided it was time to leave discreetly, gathering bags and table favors. The hall, still lit, kept the smell of hot food and open alcohol, a combination that now nauseated. Vivian tried to recompose her posture in front of 2 police officers who came in right after the paramedics. The questions were direct, and her coolness drew attention even from employees most used to formality. Lucia was called by one of the officers to confirm what she'd seen, and she answered in the simplest way possible, without frills. She recounted the sound, the touch, the identification by the uniform, and the approximate time. As she spoke, she realized her voice no longer shook, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from certainty. Dawn advanced, and the mansion began to show the fatigue of the structure after so many hours of lights on and people circulating. The corridor floor was still wet where water had spilled during the improvisation, and the air conditioning fought the heat from the crowd. The remaining guests hovered between curiosity and embarrassment, avoiding direct eye contact with Lucia. She returned to the kitchen by instinct, the place where she always found meaning in small routines. The open cabinet, the hanging cloth, all the same as at the start of the shift, but now burdened with a weight that didn't fit in words. With every sound of the house, a new memory came, the cry, the touch, the exact instant the wall gave back human warmth. Her body answered with delayed trembling, as if only now it understood the real danger of what she'd done. She braced her hands on the sink and stayed there, listening to the drip of the filter until the sound of her own breathing returned to normal. Outside, the lights of official cars flickered against the windows like intermittent flashes. The house, once the set of a party, now sounded like a building abandoned after a fire. Morning found the forensics team still collecting samples and taking measurements with tape and photographs. Lucia was kept nearby for clarification, but there was no more tension. There was procedures routine. Alfonso didn't come back inside. He went straight to the hospital with his son, leaving orders for full cooperation. Vivian was led to give a statement without visible resistance, only with the look of someone trying to maintain some control. The employees watched in silence, most not knowing how to react. Many had worked there half their lives. The crackle of police radios replaced the music still playing softly in the hall's system. Lucia sat for a moment on the step in the service corridor, her legs aching and her mind revolving slowly. Nothing she saw matched the images she knew of that place. The open wall, the frame on the floor, the smell of mold mixed with expensive perfume. Everything felt like a bad movie scene, but she was there, and the dusty marks on her hands proved it was real. When they finally let her go, the sun was already flooding the tall windows, and the day's heat was waking the garden insects. Lucia crossed the side patio, the same one she had used hours before, arriving with a starched uniform and pinned hair. Now her clothes were wrinkled, her apron stained, and her eyes burned not only from fatigue. She walked to the service gate, where the guard who always greeted her with indifference merely nodded in silence. The world outside seemed normal. Cars passing, people going to work, the kind of banality that contrasts with recent tragedy. For a moment, she wondered whether anyone would believe it all without seeing. The story was too absurd, even for those who lived inside it. But the sound of the crying still echoed insistently at the back of her mind, reminding her, there are noises you never forget. Lucia stopped on the sidewalk and breathed deeply, trying to let the outside air clean what the inside air had spoiled. The house behind her still stood, but something inside it would never be the same. The news spread quickly, appearing on websites by morning, with headlines mixing shock and sensationalism. Lucia's name didn't appear, only the generic title of Heroic Maid and distant photos taken by onlookers. She watched it all on the small TV in the staff's break room, where she was still seated, unable to go home. Each sentence from the reporters seemed to reduce the night to a convenient summary, without showing the true weight of what happened. None of them knew the exact moment when the sound ceased to be noise and became a plea for help. None mentioned the fear she felt when she realized the new lady of the house also knew. Lucia turned off the TV and stared at her darkened reflection in the screen, her face streaked with dust. The feeling of having done the right thing brought no immediate relief, only silence and a strange kind of emptiness. Outside, the city's noise sounded ordinary, and that perhaps was what hurt the most. The world went on, even after something so broken had happened before so many people. At the hospital, Alfonso spent hours at his son's bedside, according to the nurses. Julian was stable, but dehydrated and with minor infections due to the confinement. The medical team took turns, and the case drew curious onlookers even. There, as if it were an extension of the news. Lucia wasn't allowed in on the first day. Protocol required controlled visits. Still, she stayed outside, on the bench near the emergency entrance, watching the comings and goings. Her body ached as if it had been through intense physical strain, but it was mostly emotional fatigue. Her hands stung where the cement had cut them, shallow wounds that burned with sweat. She remembered the feel of the wall, the roughness, the moment the brick gave way. She thought of how many times she had cleaned that corridor without imagining what lay behind. She also wondered how many sounds like that might exist without ever being heard. Vivian was formally charged days later, and her versions began to circulate with contradictory details. Some said it was jealousy, others spoke of emotional disturbance aggravated by medication. But none of that changed the central fact. Someone had decided to hide a living child inside a wall. The papers fed on the mystery, searching for motives that might justify the unjustifiable. Lucia avoided reading, though the family name appeared everywhere. People phoned her trying to confirm facts. Reporters appeared at the back gate. She didn't answer, only kept the same rhythm. Wake, press the uniform, tend to the tasks that still remained. The house, without the noise of employees who'd been dismissed, seemed larger and emptier. Alfonso asked her to stay, promising a new role, but Lucia didn't yet know what that meant. The silence of the mornings was now as loud as the crying she had heard that night. Time in the mansion was measured by noises: the vacuum, the kettle, the wind on the stained glass. Lucia began tending to the closed rooms. including Alfonso's late wife's, which remained untouched. Dust on the objects gave the sense of a museum of memories no one wanted to visit. One morning, she stopped in front of the repaired wall in the service corridor, where the masons had already sealed everything. The new plaster still held a different tone, betraying the patch, but the shape was the same. Lucia pressed her palm on the exact spot where the hole had been, feeling the cold pierce her skin. She heard nothing, but her body reacted the same way it had that night, with her heart racing. It was as if the place still breathed, even without sound. She stayed like that for long seconds, until the distant clank of the gate made her step back. The house might be clean and quiet, but some marks don't come out even with lime. Alfonso returned from the hospital a week later with deep circles under his eyes and an unfocused stare. Julian was better, but still didn't speak about what he'd gone through. The first thing the father did upon entering was look for Lucia, and the thanks came wordlessly, just a heavy nod. He asked her to move to the guest room on the main floor, far from the back of the house. Lucia refused at first, used to being invisible, but she accepted when she realized the request wasn't kindness. It was need. In the days that followed, he began to work from home, and his presence broke the morbid quiet of the rooms. Even so, the mood remained strange, as if the air carried a memory no one dared mention. The corridor of the incident stayed blocked off, with crime scene tape still hanging from one corner. Lucia passed there and looked away, even knowing nothing else could come out of it. But at night, the echo of that crying insisted on returning. Bucky. The third night after Alfonso's return, the house filled up again, not with guests, but with familiar voices. Doctors, lawyers, and close relatives came and went, trying to normalize the impossible. Lucia served coffee and caught fragments of conversation, words like lawsuit, psychiatric evaluation, and custody. The boy, still fragile, slept almost all the time, and the house adapted to his silence. During one of those nights, while clearing the cups from the main sitting room, Lucia heard a sound that made her body lock up. It wasn't loud or continuous, it was a dry noise from the direction of the service corridor. She looked at Alfonso, who didn't notice, and set the trays on the sideboard. She followed the sound halfway, enough to recognize the same pattern as before, 3 short pauses between each sob. The plaster was intact, but the noise came from inside, and for a second, time seemed to restart exactly where it had stopped. Lucia stood still, the dish towel slipping from her hand without her noticing. The sound stopped for a few seconds, as if it too were listening, attentive to her movement. Her breathing shortened, and her first impulse was to step back, but her body didn't obey. The corridor was dark, lit only by what bled in from the main room, and the silence stretched again. She took 2 slow steps, hearing the old floor creak, until she pressed against the freshly painted wall. Nothing. No draft, no noise, no breath. Her heart beat so loudly it seemed to occupy the space where the missing sound should be. Lucia pressed her palm against the exact point where the hole had been, waiting to feel any vibration. Nothing. Only the cold cutting through the fabric of her uniform. She left the corridor and went back to the room, trying to convince herself her mind was playing tricks. In the days that followed, household tasks returned to their normal rhythm, but the house's air did not. The employees whispered, and some asked not to work nights anymore. The kitchen seemed to echo more than usual, as if the sound of pots lasted too long. Lucia pretended not to notice, focusing on the basics: wash, dry, organize. But at night, always at the same time, a faint noise came from the corridor, not always a cry. Sometimes it sounded like a gentle knock, other times a quick scratch. She began noting the times mentally, trying to find a pattern, and realized the sound always rose after 11:10 p.m. Never before, never after. Once, she took a clock to the wall and waited. The noise arrived on the dot, and goosebumps raced over her entire body. Instinct told her to tell someone, but the memory of the first reaction from others stopped her. No one would believe another story coming from the same place. She limited herself to recording it mentally. The sound lasted between 5 and 7 seconds, always interspersed with long silence. On the 4th consecutive night, Lucia decided to watch without approaching. She switched off the lights in the sitting room and stood near the curtain, looking into the corridor, almost blind. The noise came the same, but this time accompanied by a shadow, faintly cast on the opposite wall. The shape was small, irregular, as if something were moving inside. She held her breath and counted to 10. The shadow dissolved and the sound ceased, leaving only the ringing in her own ears. Lucia turned the lights back on and stayed awake the rest of the night, pretending not to remember what she'd seen. The next day, Alfonso called Lucia to talk, something rare. He thanked her again for what she had done, promised their lives would be different from then on. But in the background, Lucia saw his tired eyes, a look that avoided facing the corridor when he walked past it. There was something unresolved between them, something unsaid. She wanted to ask if he had heard anything too, but didn't have the courage. The silence between master and maid is ancient and too heavy to be broken by superstition, so she merely nodded and continued with her tasks. Inside, however, the doubt grew. Could something have remained there, not in body, but in presence, condensed memory? The wall seemed to hold a residue of energy not erased by paint and plaster. That night, the whole house turned in early, and Lucia was the last to turn out the lights. Before going up, she stopped in front of the corridor, the cloth still damp in her hands. She decided, without knowing why, to press her ear to the wall. The plasters, cold against her skin, raised the hair on her arms. At first no sound, only the distant hum of the fridge and street noise. But then, deep down, came something that wasn't exactly crying. It was breathing, slow, weak but rhythmic. Lucia recoiled so quickly she knocked over the bucket, spilling water across the floor. She watched the puddle creep toward the wall until it vanished into a small crack in the baseboard. And she swore she heard a pop from inside, as if the plaster had reacted to the touch of water. The next day, the crack was there, discreet but real. Lucia ran her finger over it and felt it was recent. The paint still shed white dust. No one seemed to have noticed, so she cleaned it quickly and covered it with a rug. The rest of the day unfolded in tense silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. All the while, she felt the wall as if it had eyes. When evening came, she tried not to pass that way, but it was impossible. The corridor connected the kitchen to the rest of the house. The sound returned, now sharper, and seemed to come from several points, not just one. Lucia stopped, looked around, but she was alone. The noise ceased the instant she blinked. For the first time, she seriously considered quitting. Sleep became the enemy. Lucia began waking up several times, thinking she heard voices between dreams. On some nights, she was sure footsteps were climbing the service stairs. She would get up to check, but there was never anyone. The fear was no longer of the sound, but of its absence when she expected it. She started avoiding the corridor at night, taking longer routes just not to pass by. One dawn, she heard a louder noise, a flat thud on the wall. She ran to see, but found the old picture on the floor again, the one that had once covered the hole. It was face down, the glass intact. Lucia knelt and, touching the frame, noticed the floor around it was damp, as if something had seeped from inside the wall. The following weeks became a cycle of vigil and tension. Alfonso hired new staff, but none stayed long. Rumors of the cursed hallway began to circulate among the employees. Lucia tried to deny them, but with each strange noise it grew harder to sustain normality. The picture was hung again, this time with double nails, but it trembled lightly every night. Julian, now recovering, avoided that side of the house without knowing why. When he passed by, the boy glanced quickly and turned his face, as if something bothered him. Lucia noticed and pretended not to, respecting the silence. The house's air weighed heavy, even on sunny mornings, and the corridor's chill never returned to normal. One dawn, near 3, a distant thunderclap woke Lucia. She heard the window latch bang and got up to close it. That's when she noticed the corridor light on. She went down in silence, thinking one of the staff had forgotten it. But the corridor was empty, and the picture again on the floor. This time the frame had a fine crack, and the wall behind it showed dark stains that hadn't been there before. Lucia turned on her phone's flashlight and saw the plaster peeling in spots, as if something were trying to get out. Her heart raced, and a low, almost imperceptible sound came from inside. A child's sob, not of pain, but of lament. She dropped the phone's light and ran without looking back. The next day, Alfonso found the marked wall and ordered the repair redone. He called in new masons who scraped and applied fresh cement. Lucia watched from a distance, trying to convince herself it would end, but the workers complained the entire time. They said the plaster wouldn't take, that the mix slid down on its own. One even joked it seemed the wall was sweating. When they finished, it looked normal, but the corridor's air was heavy, as if oxygen were lacking. Lucia avoided passing there for the rest of the day. At night, she heard it again. Not crying this time, but a short laugh, weak, and the metallic sound of something tapping from inside the wall. She closed her eyes and prayed silently, her whole body shaking. She no longer knew which was worse, to hear or to hear nothing. The next morning, one of the new employees quit. He said he wouldn't sleep under that roof again, that he'd heard someone crying from inside the walls while he cleaned the corridor. Lucia didn't ask for details. She only looked at the spot he indicated and confirmed it was the same. Alfonso tried to keep calm and had the access sealed, new lights installed, the floor replaced, but no renovation seemed to solve it. The place remained cold, and even the family's pets avoided going through there. Julian, now stronger, once asked why that corridor always smelled like rain, even on dry days. Lucia said it was just old plumbing, though she knew it wasn't. The boy looked again, fixed on the wall, and simply said, "I remember that sound." That was enough for her to decide she needed to leave. Lucia resigned the following week with a simple explanation: exhaustion. Alfonso tried to insist, offered a raise, but she refused. She said she needed to breathe different air, and he, even without understanding, agreed. On the day she packed her things, the house seemed quieter than ever, no noise, no vibration. But as she closed the last box, she heard slow steps climbing the service stairs. She thought it was one of the guards, but no one appeared. The steps stopped at the bedroom door, and for a moment, the sound of a child's breathing returned. Soft, close, almost familiar. Lucia turned quickly. The room was empty. She left the house before sunset, taking only what fit in a small suitcase. The path to the gate felt longer, perhaps because of her desire not to look back. The wind carried the scent of garden flowers mixed with the dust of recent repairs. When she passed in front of the corridor, something made her stop. The picture was back on the wall, even after it had been stored in the storeroom. The late afternoon light gilded the frame, and for a second she swore she saw movement behind the glass. A small, hunched shadow, like someone drawing away. Lucia blinked, and the image vanished. She quickened her step, crossed the gate, and never returned. But the feeling of being watched followed her all the way to the street. In the days that followed, she tried to adapt to a new routine, far from the mansion. She rented a simple room in a distant neighborhood and avoided talking about the past. But sleep was never the same again. Sometimes she woke in the night with the impression of hearing soft knocks on the wall beside the bed. Other times, the sound of water trickling, just like the night she spilled the bucket. Once, she got up and pressed her ear to the room's wall. On the other side, the same pattern of short, childlike breathing. Lucia stepped back, sat on the bed, and stayed there until dawn, hands in her lap, afraid to move. That old sensation returned whole. Fear and pity mixed. Weeks later, she received an unexpected call. It was Alfonso. His voice sounded older, dragged. He said only that the house was being sold and that he preferred not to keep in touch with anyone who had worked there. Before hanging up, Lucia asked, without knowing why, if he still heard the sound. Silence on the other end, then a short sentence. Some things don't stop, they just move. The line went dead, and Lucia stared at the phone as if waiting for the echo of his voice. In that moment, she understood the story no longer belonged to anyone. It belonged to the house. Today, years later, the La Vega mansion stands empty. Locals say that at night, you can still hear noises coming from inside, especially behind the wall in the service corridor. No one has lived there for a long time, but neighbors swear they see lights on at dawn. Lucia avoids passing nearby, though sometimes the bus line she takes runs along the same street. When that happens, she turns her gaze away, through the window, and clutches the rosary in her pocket, in silence. The sound she heard that night never left her head. She doesn't know if it was the boy, something that stayed trapped with him, or if horror creates its own echo. She only knows that when the bus pulls away, she always hears it again. That same crying, muffled, as if coming from inside the walls.